I recently purchased a home from an older couple who were decided to leave the state and move down south because it was too expensive to live here. Their daughter, who's also she's in her late 20s, she also moved down south before them. What do you tell people who are leaving Connecticut because it's too expensive to live here, and how do you fix it?
I always tell them I'm going to miss them. I'm not going anywhere, but it is a problem. And it's not just with people who can make the decision to sell their home to someone. We have a number of residents in Norwich, elderly. There are several just down the street from me. She's just recently made the decision. My husband was doing house calls to see her, and she just made the decision that she's going to have to just move. She didn't want to make the decision. Financially, she was left with nothing. The bank now owns more of the house than it is worth. She has pulled more equity out. She has to just abandon her home. The house across the street, the same thing happened. The family abandoned the home. They moved out. She's going to be living in an elderly complex. Because it is expensive, so that she can't pay the taxes and she can't keep the maintenance up on the house. That issue is created because of the high cost of our property taxes in Norwich. There are 78% of people that are renting in our community are living below the poverty line. These are people that are renting, okay? It is such a burden to help to continue to pay for the services that are essential in Norwich. The same issue is at the state level. You cannot continue, they're finding it difficult to continue to provide just even basic services for people. So they don't just move out of Norwich, they move out of Connecticut. Some of the things that I think...
If we could get to, so how do we, you having identified the problem?
That is the problem, and the problem is obviously our budgets. When we begin to talk about to me, what the real issue is, it is our budget, the state budget. And what are we going to do to correct the direction the state budget has gone in? I mean, we're now going through several years of depleting a rainy day fund. Next year is why any one of the three of us want to be in Hartford for next year when this comes crashing down but I think that maybe all three of us think that there's a way to finally get out of this, and it is through the budget. You cannot continue to let corporations decide that they will only come to Connecticut when you give them $25, $30, $50 million of our bond money to help them relocate here, so that a year later, as Cigna did, when they decided not to enact Sustanet, brought Cigna back in with more of our bond money so that they could then turn around 1 year later and move their finance department to India. Every corporation has a real civic responsibility to maintain the services that they use in the state, both the infrastructure and the quality of life that they originally came here for. That, to me, is number one. The corporate giveaways and the corporate welfare in this state has to stop. The second thing that will impact the budget substantially is by increasing our minimum wage. This January, it finally comes up to $10.10 an hour. There's not one single person in this room, not one, that could live on $10.10 an hour if you worked a full-time job. It's not possible. So not until the state decides, and it's not just going to be at the federal level. Individual states, New York has already done it. The minimum wage has to go up to at least $15 an hour so it's a livable wage.
Just to be fair, I'm going to move it along.
Okay.
You raised two
Okay.
points you feel have
Well,
to be
3,
addressed.
sustainant was a real big point for the budget.
All right, thank you. Representative Riley, the issue that we're losing both many of our seniors and younger people are relocating out of Connecticut because of the expense of living here. If you could address that.
Sure, certainly. As far as seniors, I know many individuals that have moved south. They've put a lifetime of work here in the state of Connecticut. Obviously, New England weather is different than it is in the south. Winters can be somewhat more harsh. An individual of an older age does have more difficulty in moving around in the climate that we have during the winter months. So I can understand why individuals would move south in that regard. As far as younger students, I think there was something that came out in one of the local papers, the Current, this past week, that more grads from the University of Connecticut are in fact staying in Connecticut. So I'm not quite sure how many people of the younger age are moving out. And one of the things that the House Democrats has proposed is for first-time college grad buyers is lowering the taxes that they have to pay on buying a home for the first 3 years of their purchase. So that's an incentive that we've put forward, and we hopefully will be able to pass that this coming session. As far as the minimum wage, I can proudly say that I have voted twice to increase the minimum wage, and I will certainly do it again till we get to a point, probably much past $15 an hour, to have a livable wage for those individuals that work on a daily basis for 40 or 45 hours a week. It's unfair and not American for an individual to be able to work that amount of time and not be able to provide for themselves, let alone their family members.
Mr. Dempsky.
So the question is, how do we stop people from feeling the need to move from the state?
Correct, and we've heard some ideas from your
Right.
opponents like
So
yours.
that starts with spending originating in the General Assembly in Hartford. We passed the largest tax increase in the state's history, the second largest tax increase in the state's history. We don't have a revenue problem. We have a spending problem. And until we get serious about controlling the spending, we are going to continue to see the legislature look for quote-unquote creative ways to tax people in the state, mileage tax, putting tolls on the highways, et cetera. If not, flat out trying to raise the income tax. So, 2 years ago when I ran, I had mentioned that I had heard about tolls being talked about being put in. And Representative Riley said he hadn't heard any such thing. And well, 2 months after the election, driving down the highway, what do I hear on the news? That's what we're talking about. So, until we control spending, you can tax until the cows come home. The nature of government is that it will find a way to spend that money. So that's where the problem needs to originate. Now, with regard to minimum wage, frankly, I think it's un-American for government to dictate to a private citizen what they must pay another individual. When you're talking about a wage of any kind, how is that transacted? It's two people or a person in a business agreeing on a job for a wage. Nobody's making anybody go to work for X amount of money. They freely enter into a contract, and the truth of the matter is, when you mandate what a company or an individual has to pay for a service, that job doesn't get created ultimately. Representative Riley said he'd like to see more than $15 an hour. I don't know how many minimum wage jobs are worth, $17 an hour. What's the right figure? Why don't we just pay people $25 an hour? Why don't we pay them $50 an hour and call it a day?
Can you on the record for that?
And so, yeah, sure, go ahead. And the answer to the question is because at some point, you cannot sustain what you are mandating a company spend or an individual spend when they contract for services. Those jobs will not be created, and that's what we're talking about. We're losing jobs. We need to create jobs. We don't need to add what essentially is another tax on top of business. If you think about it in these terms, the legislature is taxing essentially everything that moves, and now they're looking to port more of a tax out onto private business by saying you must pay X amount to an individual for whatever job it is that they're getting into, and essentially pay them money that we would like to pay them, but we don't have in the budget. So you go ahead and shoulder that burden. That's not how we do things in this country. So you control spending so that you can ultimately reduce taxes, and you also need to take a look at regulations, which are, in addition to the minimum wage, which you maybe classify as regulation, is an additional tax on business, because especially small businesses aren't typically able to bear the burden of these regulations that get put on them like large businesses are. So it's a prohibitive factor from them either entering the marketplace or staying in the marketplace. So those are the things that we need to take a look at in order to reverse the trend, create an economy in Connecticut that is pro-business and pro-job creation, and remove the incentive for people to want to leave the state and to stay here.
Want to give, we'll start with Ms.
If
Hong, and I'll give you.
I may, I want to.
I want to give you. Yeah, I will get back.
I want to make sure that it is known that I did not vote for those either one of those tax increases. I was one of 11 Democrats that did not vote for those tax increases.
Okay.
That's correct.
Okay.
But Representative Riley did vote for the implementers for the budget. So whether he technically voted against the budget and voted against the tax increase, he voted for the implementers. So it's is
that the same thing?
It's the same thing.
In fact,
you're voting to implement it. You're not standing up and
let's
saying
give him
no,
a chance.
If I could answer the question, I did vote against it, and there were provisions in that budget that were removed before those implementers took place.
Mrs. Hong, I want to give you a chance to. Mr. Dempsky has said he considers raising the minimum wage counterproductive in that it may hurt job creation, and he sees the key problem as cutting government spending to keep people in Connecticut.
Well, I don't think you can cut much more than has been done this past year. It's absolutely devastated the state group homes, with the cuts to the social service agencies that are going to be expected to take over the care of these group home residents. They've also had all of their budgets cut. There is. I am never in favor of keeping people in poverty that actually makes slave workers out of American citizens. There is no opportunity to get out of poverty without at least some opportunity to do so. And you don't have that opportunity if all you're making is barely enough money. If you get food stamps and you get some housing assistance, you can barely make enough money on the minimum wage to survive. So you may be lucky enough not to know a single person who is doing exactly that today in Norwich. I know too many of them that work 2 and 3 jobs. None of that is American. And to think that people that fought years ago to make sure that children didn't have to work in this country, that a minimum wage was at least the minimum that a company can pay an individual for making them rich. That to me is not acceptable. That's not American, and that's not acceptable. So
But Mr. Dempsky, to be fair, certainly.
I just want to make sure that we all understand that minimum wage positions traditionally are entry-level positions, and they aren't designed to sustain. They aren't designed to sustain a family of 1, 2, 3, 4. They're entry-level positions. They're positions where the employee comes in. Yes, they get a wage for what they do. They also gain work experience that they can then use to leverage their experience to get better employment that pays a better wage. That's how the market economy works.
No,
so
it's not.
Well,
let me respond
No,
to that.
I'm going to
because
move.
he's
I'm
not-
going to move
right,
to another
because
question. If
he's
you want to weave it
absolutely
into a
wrong.
future, you can.
All right,
but
he's
I think we've clarified quite well the positions, all
Okay.
3 candidates on that issue.